Here is the completed story intro following your required structure. SUA, I hung one flag on my own porch. So HOA Karen called the feds and lost her estate. How could one flag lead to something this unexpected? What really happened after that single decision? Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy compelling HOA justice stories filled with suspense, remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Your support means everything, and thank you for watching, sharing, and being part of this growing community. Before we begin, tell us where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are right now. We always enjoy seeing viewers joining from different places across the globe. Now, let us begin the story. My grandfather always told me that the quickest way to discover who truly respects freedom is to exercise an ordinary right without asking for permission. I did not think about those words until the morning I hung a single American flag from the porch of my home in Cedar Ridge, a quiet subdivision where freshly trimmed lawns mattered almost as much as appearances. The air smelled like cut grass and fresh coffee drifting from neighboring kitchens, and the sunlight reflected across polished windows, as if nothing unusual could ever happen there. I had lived in that house for nearly 6 years, and every improvement I made had followed the governing documents, county regulations, and every applicable law I could find. The flag was new, carefully folded the night before, and attached to a simple bracket beside my front door with stainless steel screws I had measured twice before installing. I stepped back about 20 feet onto the walkway, admired how it moved gently in the summer breeze, and felt something surprisingly peaceful. It was not meant to provoke anyone. It was simply a personal expression displayed on my own property. I had barely taken my first sip of coffee when I heard the unmistakable sound of expensive heels striking the concrete sidewalk in quick, confident steps. I looked up and immediately recognized Linda Parker, the president of our homeowners association. She carried her familiar leather portfolio under one arm and a clipboard in the other hand, wearing the same controlled smile that usually appeared just before another resident received an official warning. She stopped precisely at the edge of my driveway, looked directly at the flag without greeting me, and shook her head. She informed me that the display violated community standards and demanded that I remove it within 1 hour. I politely asked her to identify the specific covenant she believed prohibited it. Instead of answering, she repeated that the association had already decided the matter. Her confidence suggested she expected immediate obedience, not questions. I remained calm and explained that I preferred to review any written authority before making changes to my own property. That answer clearly frustrated her. She flipped through several papers, tapped one page with her finger, then looked back at me with absolute certainty. She said that if I refused to comply, she would escalate the issue beyond the association itself. Her final sentence lingered in the warm morning air longer than I expected. She announced that she would contact the federal government if necessary because, in her words, people like me needed to learn there were consequences for ignoring authority. I watched her walk back toward her luxury SUV without raising my voice or taking another step. The neighborhood became strangely quiet after the engine disappeared around the corner. I stood alone on my porch, looked once more at the flag moving peacefully against the blue sky, and realized that sometimes the loudest threat begins with someone who never expects to have their own decisions examined. The first official notice arrived before noon the next day, folded neatly inside a bright white envelope bearing the familiar Homeowners Association logo that every resident immediately recognized. I opened it at my kitchen counter while the smell of fresh coffee still lingered in the room, expecting another generic reminder about landscaping or seasonal maintenance. Instead, I found a formal violation letter stating that my flag display allegedly conflicted with community appearance standards and that a daily fine would begin if I failed to remove it within 24 hours. What caught my attention was not the amount of the fine, but the complete absence of any citation identifying the exact rule I had supposedly violated. I carried the letter into my home office, where shelves filled with property records, closing documents, surveys, and homeowner paperwork lined one wall. Years of legal consulting had taught me that assumptions rarely survive careful documentation. I placed the violation letter beside my original deed, the recorded plat map, my purchase paperwork, and the complete set of governing documents I had received when I bought the house. I read every page slowly, highlighting sections that discussed exterior maintenance, architectural modifications, seasonal decorations, and community standards. The language was detailed in many places, but nowhere did I find the prohibition described in Linda's letter. Late that afternoon, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. This one repeated the violation and warned that additional enforcement measures could follow if I continued refusing to comply. The wording sounded more aggressive, yet it still avoided identifying any specific covenant. As the days passed, neighbors who usually waved while walking their dogs suddenly became unusually quiet whenever they reached my sidewalk. Some looked toward the flag before looking away. Others offered polite smiles that seemed uncertain, as though they had already heard a version of the story that I had not. I noticed a parked vehicle slowly driving past my house twice during the same evening, and although nothing unlawful occurred, it reinforced the feeling that ordinary routines had become objects of unusual attention. I refused to let frustration dictate my response. Instead, I started a simple system. Every letter received was scanned. Every envelope was preserved. Every conversation was summarized with the date and time written in a notebook that remained on my desk. I photographed the flag each morning from the same position on my front walkway, so there would never be confusion about what had actually been displayed. The more carefully I documented each step, the calmer I became. Meanwhile, the notices continued arriving with increasing urgency, each one repeating conclusions without providing the authority behind them. On the fourth morning I unfolded the newest letter, noticed another reference to possible federal involvement, and quietly smiled for the first time since this entire dispute had begun. Whoever drafted these notices seemed convinced that confidence alone could replace precise language. Experience had taught me that the smallest omission inside an official document often becomes the largest problem once every page is finally placed under careful examination. My father used to remind me that people often reveal the weakness of their position by insisting you stop asking questions. Those words echoed in my mind as I drove to the county records office 2 mornings later with a folder full of association notices resting on the passenger seat. The building itself was quiet, filled with the soft sound of printers, keyboards, and conversations spoken just above a whisper. I requested copies of every document connected to my subdivision, including the original declaration, recorded amendments, plat maps, and every publicly filed supplement that had become part of the development over the years. The clerk smiled politely, disappeared into the archive area, and returned carrying a thick stack of certified records that looked untouched for years. I spent nearly 3 hours at one of the reading tables carefully comparing every page against the copies I had received from the Homeowners Association when I purchased my house. At first, everything appeared identical, but I had learned long ago that the truth rarely announces itself on the first page. It usually waits inside an overlooked attachment or an amendment that nobody bothers to read. Near the back of the file, I found exactly that. Attached behind an amendment recorded more than 15 years earlier was a federal compliance memorandum acknowledging that homeowners retain protected rights regarding certain displays on private residential property, provided basic safety requirements were satisfied. Even more surprising, the memorandum specifically instructed associations to avoid adopting or enforcing rules that directly conflicted with applicable federal protections. I immediately compared that language with the wording inside Linda's violation letters. They were completely different. Her notices confidently claimed authority that the recorded documents never granted. I requested certified copies of every relevant page, complete with official county seals, then placed them carefully into my folder before driving home. That afternoon, another violation letter arrived, increasing the daily fines once again and repeating the same unsupported demand that I remove the flag immediately. For the first time since this situation had begun, I felt completely at ease. The documents in my hands were not opinions or interpretations. They were recorded public records carrying legal weight far beyond neighborhood assumptions. I scanned every certified page into my computer, backed them up onto 2 separate external drives, and organized them in chronological order beside every notice the association had mailed to me. Then I created a timeline listing each conversation, every letter, every deadline, and every action taken by both sides. Looking at everything together revealed a pattern that had not been obvious before. Every new notice relied on confidence instead of documented authority, while every official record pointed in exactly the opposite direction. Just before sunset, I stepped onto my front porch with another cup of coffee and watched the flag move quietly in the warm breeze. Across the street, Linda slowed her vehicle as she passed my house and glanced toward the porch with the same certainty she had shown from the beginning. She could not have known that the smallest document buried inside an old county archive had already begun changing the direction of everything that would happen next. My first law professor once said that the most expensive mistake anyone can make is believing confidence carries the same weight as written authority. That lesson returned to me on Friday morning when a certified envelope arrived requiring my signature before the mail carrier would hand it over. Inside was a formal notice stating that the Homeowners Association had elevated the matter beyond routine enforcement and had reported what they described as possible violations to federal authorities. I read every page twice, not because I was worried, but because I wanted to understand exactly what had been claimed. The language was dramatic, filled with references to compliance and enforcement, yet it still avoided identifying any genuine legal basis for demanding that I remove the flag from my own porch. Instead of responding immediately, I placed the new documents beside the certified county records I had collected only days earlier. Side by side, the contrast was impossible to ignore. One stack consisted of recorded public documents supported by official filings. The other relied almost entirely on conclusions that pointed back to the association itself. Late that afternoon, my telephone rang. The caller identified himself as an employee from a federal office responsible for reviewing public complaints. His voice was calm, respectful, and entirely professional. He explained that a report had been received and that he wished to gather basic information before determining whether any further review was necessary. I answered every question directly, never offering opinions where facts would do. When he asked whether I possessed supporting documentation, I simply replied that I had certified copies of every relevant county record, complete governing documents, photographs taken throughout the entire timeline, and organized correspondence from the association. There was a brief pause before he thanked me for maintaining detailed records. He then requested electronic copies of everything for preliminary review. Within an hour, I had uploaded neatly labeled files containing every letter, photograph, timeline entry, and certified document in chronological order. I included nothing unnecessary because experience had taught me that organized evidence speaks more clearly than emotional arguments ever could. The following Monday, another call arrived from the same office. This time the questions sounded different. Instead of asking about my property, the investigator wanted to know whether the Homeowners Association had previously provided me with copies of the governing documents they claimed authorized their actions. He also asked whether I had ever received written explanations identifying the exact provisions they believed I had violated. I answered honestly that every notice repeated the same demand, without citing language matching the recorded documents in my possession. The conversation ended politely, but something had clearly shifted. Later that evening, I noticed a black government vehicle parked outside the association clubhouse, while several individuals carried document boxes through the front entrance. No lights flashed, and no voices were raised. Everything unfolded quietly, professionally, and without unnecessary attention. Linda arrived a few minutes later, stepping from her vehicle with the same confident posture I had seen since the beginning. Yet this time she remained outside the building for several moments, speaking into her telephone while repeatedly glancing toward the clubhouse entrance. Standing on my porch beneath the flag that had started everything, I realized the focus of the entire situation no longer appeared to be my front yard. It had begun moving somewhere Linda had never expected anyone to look. My grandfather believed that the truth has a quiet rhythm because it never needs to rush anyone. 3 days after the investigators first requested my records, another courteous telephone call arrived asking whether I would be available to answer several follow-up questions in person. We agreed to meet at the local federal office the following morning. The building was modest, clean, and surprisingly calm, nothing like the dramatic scenes people often imagine from television. The investigator greeted me with a firm handshake, thanked me for organizing every document chronologically, and explained that orderly records often shortened complicated reviews. We spent nearly 2 hours walking through my timeline one event at a time. Every letter from the Homeowners Association matched a photograph. Every conversation matched a dated note. and every claim could be compared directly against certified county records. At no point did anyone suggest that displaying the flag itself violated the law. Instead, the questions gradually shifted toward the association's procedures. They wanted to know when the fines had started, whether I had ever received an appeal hearing before penalties increased, and whether the governing documents provided to homeowners matched the language being quoted in enforcement notices. I answered each question carefully, resisting the temptation to speculate. Facts had carried me this far, and I intended to let them continue doing the work. Before I left, the investigator thanked me once again and mentioned that additional records had already been requested from the association. Driving home beneath a bright blue sky, I realized something important had changed. I was no longer defending myself. I was simply helping clarify a sequence of documented events. The following week became noticeably different around the neighborhood. The usual stream of warning letters suddenly stopped. My mailbox, which had become almost predictable in delivering another demand every afternoon, remained empty for several days. Even more unusual, the association website quietly removed the section listing outstanding compliance fines. Several neighbors later told me they could no longer view previous violation summaries that had once appeared there. Nobody officially explained the changes, but they were impossible to overlook. Then one evening, I noticed several board members carrying storage boxes from the association office into the clubhouse meeting room. Through the front windows, I could see stacks of binders spread across long tables, with people carefully comparing pages instead of speaking very much. Linda arrived carrying another large portfolio, yet her confident stride had become noticeably slower. She entered the building without acknowledging anyone outside and remained inside until well after sunset. A close neighbor casually mentioned that the board had called multiple emergency meetings during the week, something that had almost never happened before. I simply thanked him and continued watering the flower beds along my front walkway. The flag moved gently above me in the evening breeze exactly as it had every day since I first installed it. Looking up at it, I remembered how quickly one ordinary decision had been treated as a serious violation. Now the same decision had quietly redirected attention toward years of paperwork, policies, and administrative choices that reached far beyond my own front porch. For the first time since all of this began, I sensed that the documents sitting inside my filing cabinet were no longer the most important records in the story. The association's own files had become the center of everyone's attention. My father often said that patterns become impossible to ignore once enough honest records are placed side by side. Nearly 2 weeks after the first investigator contacted me, I received another invitation to answer a few additional questions, but this meeting felt noticeably different from the previous one. Instead of discussing my property, the investigators wanted to compare timelines, official correspondence, and association procedures that extended back several years. They explained that documents collected during their review had revealed inconsistencies requiring closer examination. They never disclosed confidential details, but they asked whether I had experienced any unusual enforcement before this dispute or whether neighbors had ever mentioned receiving similar notices. I answered carefully, recalling conversations with longtime residents who had quietly accepted fines rather than challenged them because they believed the board always knew the law better than they did. The investigators listened without interruption, occasionally comparing my responses with files already spread across the conference table. As I gathered my papers to leave, one investigator thanked me for remaining patient throughout the process and remarked that well-organized records often reveal far more than emotional accusations ever can. That sentence stayed with me during the drive home. A few days later, several neighbors unexpectedly knocked on my front door. They had heard rumors that official reviewers were requesting historical association records and wanted to know whether I understood what was happening. I simply explained that I had cooperated by providing factual documents and encouraged them to preserve any notices or correspondence they had received over the years. One elderly couple returned the following afternoon carrying a folder that had been sitting inside a filing cabinet for nearly a decade. Inside were violation notices using language remarkably similar to the letters I had received, along with responses that had never been answered. Another homeowner discovered old meeting minutes mentioning concerns about enforcement consistency, while someone else located financial statements showing repeated collections from disputed fines. None of these neighbors arrived seeking revenge. They simply wanted clarity after years of uncertainty. I suggested that anyone contacted by investigators should provide complete and accurate records without speculation. Within another week, the atmosphere throughout Cedar Ridge had changed completely. The association office remained open, but activity inside looked different. Board members entered carrying archive boxes instead of landscaping plans, and the parking lot filled with vehicles belonging to accountants, legal representatives, and document specialists rather than contractors. Linda still appeared at the clubhouse almost every day, although the confidence that once defined her public presence had gradually been replaced by quiet concentration. She no longer stopped to lecture residents while walking through the neighborhood, and the stream of enforcement letters that had once arrived with remarkable frequency had ended altogether. Standing on my porch one cool evening, I watched the flag move steadily beneath a sky painted with the last colors of sunset. I realized that this story had never truly been about one display outside my front door. It had become a careful examination of years of decisions preserved inside filing cabinets, meeting minutes, financial ledgers, and official records. Every document collected by every homeowner formed another piece of a much larger picture, and that picture was becoming clearer with every passing day. My grandfather believed that the most powerful surprise is the one that has been quietly prepared for years without anyone realizing it. That thought stayed with me when I received another invitation to meet with the investigators, this time not to answer new questions, but simply to clarify the timeline surrounding my documentation. The conference room looked much different than before. Several binders rested neatly across the table beside printed copies of county records, homeowners association correspondence, meeting minutes, and certified amendments. As we reviewed the sequence of events, one investigator paused, looked at me, and asked how I had known exactly which public records to request so early in the dispute. I smiled because it was finally the right moment to explain something I had intentionally kept in the background from the beginning. Years before moving into Cedar Ridge, I had spent more than a decade working as a legal consultant on regulatory compliance projects involving property governance, administrative procedures, and the interpretation of federal protections affecting residential communities. My role had never involved enforcing the law, but it required understanding how government agencies evaluated documentation, procedural fairness, and conflicts between local policies and federal requirements. I explained that experience had taught me never to argue first and never to assume anyone was acting in bad faith without evidence. Instead, I always began with recorded documents because properly maintained records usually answered questions more accurately than opinions ever could. The investigators exchanged brief glances before one of them quietly remarked that my methodical documentation had made their review significantly more efficient. Then another investigator opened a binder containing correspondence submitted by the Homeowners Association. As the pages turned, I recognized several statements Linda had made in official notices. The investigator pointed out that many of those conclusions relied upon provisions that did not appear in the certified governing documents obtained directly from county records. Even more significant, the association had apparently provided historical policy summaries that differed from earlier recorded amendments preserved in public archives. No dramatic accusations followed. Nobody raised a voice. The facts simply sat together on the table, each document confirming or contradicting another until the complete sequence became unmistakably clear. Driving home afterward, I reflected on how easily this entire situation could have ended differently if I had responded emotionally instead of patiently collecting evidence. Later that evening, several neighbors stopped while walking past my porch. Word had begun spreading that the review was no longer centered on one homeowner or one flag, but on administrative practices extending back many years. They asked whether I had expected any of this when the first violation notice arrived. I admitted that I had expected a disagreement, perhaps even a formal appeal, but I had never imagined that one ordinary decision would encourage so many people to examine records they had accepted without question for so long. As the sun disappeared beyond the rooftops, the flag continued moving gently above my front porch exactly as it had since the first morning. The difference was no longer the flag itself. The difference was that every official document surrounding it had finally been placed beside the records that truly governed the neighborhood, And once those pages were compared honestly, the appearance of authority could no longer compete with the weight of documented truth. My father often reminded me that real justice rarely arrives with flashing lights or dramatic speeches, because it usually arrives inside carefully written conclusions that cannot be argued away. Nearly a month after the first violation notice appeared in my mailbox, the Homeowners Association announced a special community meeting at the clubhouse. The notice described it as an opportunity to discuss recent administrative matters, but everyone in Cedar Ridge already understood why nearly every seat in the room would be filled that evening. I arrived a few minutes early carrying nothing except a thin folder containing my original records. For the first time since this entire situation had begun, I did not expect to present evidence. The evidence had already been reviewed. Residents quietly gathered around folding tables while conversations drifted through the room in low voices. Linda entered with several remaining board members, taking her usual seat at the front of the meeting room. Although she remained professional and composed, the confidence that had once defined every public appearance had softened into careful restraint. After routine business concluded, the association attorney stood and explained that outside reviews of the association's administrative practices had identified multiple procedural deficiencies requiring immediate corrective action. He carefully avoided dramatic language, but every sentence carried significant weight. Existing violation notices connected to the disputed enforcement actions would be withdrawn. Outstanding fines associated with those notices would be canceled. Internal governance procedures would undergo comprehensive revision to ensure future enforcement remained consistent with recorded governing documents and applicable legal standards. The room became remarkably quiet. No one celebrated. No one argued. Homeowners simply listened as years of assumptions gave way to documented conclusions. Then another announcement followed. Several board members, including Linda, had voluntarily submitted resignations to allow the community to elect new leadership during a special election scheduled for the following month. Linda stood, thanked the residents for the opportunity to serve the neighborhood over the years, and acknowledged that leadership required public confidence as much as authority. She offered no excuses and made no accusations before quietly returning to her seat. I respected the professionalism of that moment because it reflected exactly what the entire process should have been from the beginning. When residents were invited to speak, several neighbors shared thoughtful comments about transparency, communication, and the importance of understanding governing documents before enforcing them. An elderly homeowner described how relieved she felt knowing questions could finally be asked without fear of immediate penalties. Another resident suggested creating an online archive where every homeowner could easily access recorded documents instead of relying on unofficial summaries. The proposal received widespread support throughout the room. As the meeting ended, many people approached me, not to congratulate me, but simply to thank me for remaining patient and documenting everything so carefully. I told each of them the same thing. None of this happened because I won an argument. It happened because public records, accurate timelines, and honest documentation were allowed to speak for themselves. Later that evening, I walked back to my house beneath a sky filled with quiet stars. The flag still moved gently above my porch exactly as it had every day since the beginning. The only real difference was that the neighborhood beneath it had begun choosing facts over assumptions, and that change felt far more meaningful than any individual victory ever could. My grandfather used to close every family gathering with the same quiet reminder that rights survive only when ordinary people are willing to understand them before someone else tries to redefine them. 6 months passed, and Cedar Ridge no longer felt like the neighborhood where this story had begun. The newly elected Homeowners Association board adopted a completely different approach to community leadership. Every recorded governing document was scanned into a searchable online archive that every resident could access at any hour of the day. Meeting agendas were published well in advance, financial reports became easier to review, and proposed policy changes were circulated weeks before any vote took place. Instead of assuming homeowners understood complicated legal language, the new board invited volunteer attorneys and property professionals from within the community to explain major amendments during open meetings. Attendance steadily increased because people finally believed their questions would receive thoughtful answers instead of immediate warnings. The atmosphere throughout the neighborhood changed in subtle ways that mattered far more than perfectly trimmed hedges or freshly painted fences. Neighbors who had once hurried past one another now paused to talk while walking their dogs or collecting their mail. Conversations that previously centered on rumors gradually shifted toward facts because everyone had access to the same documents. One Saturday morning, while I was watering flowers beside my front porch, a young couple stopped to introduce themselves after purchasing a home a few streets away. They smiled, glanced at the flag moving gently above the porch, and admitted they had heard pieces of the story from longtime residents. They thanked me for encouraging transparency without creating unnecessary conflict. I simply told them that no individual should ever become the center of a neighborhood's governance. The documents should always remain the foundation because written rules protect everyone equally when they are applied honestly. They nodded before continuing their morning walk, leaving me with the comforting realization that the most meaningful victories often become ordinary enough that future homeowners simply accept them as normal. Inside my home office, the filing cabinet containing every letter, photograph, certified record, and timeline remained exactly where I had placed it throughout the investigation. I opened the drawer one afternoon, looked through the carefully labeled folders, and realized I had not needed to add another violation notice since the day the review concluded. The records had become less of a defense and more of a reminder that patience, organization, and respect for the law can quietly accomplish what anger rarely achieves. Before closing the drawer, I placed one final note on top of the file. It simply read that the dispute had ended because facts remained consistent even when opinions changed. Then I stepped outside into the warm evening air. The flag still moved peacefully in the gentle breeze exactly where I had first installed it months earlier. Nothing about it looked extraordinary, yet every time I saw it I remembered that the greatest lesson from this experience had never been about one porch or one homeowners association. It was about the enduring value of staying calm, preserving the truth, and trusting that carefully documented facts will always stand longer than borrowed authority. My grandfather had been right all along. Justice does not need to be loud. It only needs to be patient, honest, and inevitable.